As we're starting to analyze poetry, what we use is a process called PEM, and PEM stands for paraphrase, imagery, and mood. When we paraphrase something, we are simply putting it in our own words, much like when we annotate. When we talk about imagery, that is when the author or the poet uses words so descriptive that we can form an image in our mind and we are able to visualize. And the mood, we associate mood with emotions. Mood is what the reader feels. So we think about it in either a positive or a negative way. So the way that this looks on a poem is you organize it. So on your poem, you're going to draw lines on either side. And then you're going to add one more over here. So you should have 3 vertical lines. Then you're going to want to draw lines underneath each stanza. When I say the word stanza, that might be a new word to you, or it might be familiar. Stanza is this grouping of lines. So when we talk about poetry, we do not use the word paragraph, but it's sort of like you can think about it as the same thing. So this is a stanza, and this one thing is a line, but this is also a stanza. This stanza just has one line. So this poem has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 stanzas. Now we're going to label what we now have our boxes. So up here, this is where we identify the mood of each stanza. So this column will be full of plus and minuses. Over here we have imagery. This is where you're going to draw a picture of what you see in your mind. And over here is your paraphrase, where you put it in your own words. You don't have to do it in this order. Sometimes the first thing that comes to mind is you automatically get a picture in your mind of what the stanza says, or sometimes the first thing you say is like, ooh, I know what the mood of that is. But always the very first step that we take when we analyze poetry is the first time just read it. Meet the poem, what's your first impression, and then you can go back stanza by stanza to analyze. So this is Introduction to Poetry. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say, drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So after you step away from this poem, what you might take away from it is, oh, at the end, things got pretty serious. We talked about torture. We talked about beating. So automatically we knew that at the end of this poem, we turned it into a negative mood. And hopefully, as a reader, you're intrigued. You're like, what do you mean tie a poem to a chair? So we'll want to back up to figure out how we got there. So in the beginning of the poem, the first stanza says, I asked to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide. So you might form this visual in your mind of someone holding a poem and a light. I'm going to draw a little lamp and wow everybody with my artistic skills. And you got to think about, okay, why would somebody hold anything up to a light? Well, when you look up at a light, you're able to see everything better. So this person, the speaker here, is, oh, I can see so much better now that I put it up to the light. So your paraphrase here would be to look closely at a poem. And this is like a moment of finding things out, of enlightenment. So this is positive. Okay, we're surely not beating anything in this stanza. Next stanza is just one line. Or press an ear against its hive. So for this one, you'd have to know what a hive is, and so that's a beehive, where the bees live. Bzz. And we know that poems, they're not literal all the time. So we want to think about pressing an ear against something. Just like this, when we held something up to the light, why would you press an ear against something? This is my big old ear. Same thing. Oh, I pressed an ear against something, so now, just like my first stanza, instead of looking closely, am listening closely. So we're getting a sense that our poet wants us to take a poem and just pay attention, essentially. And this is very similar. It's still a positive mood. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe its way out. Okay, so for this one, you'd have to have some background knowledge about what happens when you drop a mouse into anything. And so I think about scientists and their little mazes. And then they put rats and mice in there so that they can figure out, you know, what's going to motivate a mouse to move. They do little experiments. So I'm going to put my little mouse in the maze. He's dropping in. He's like, ah. But again, we're thinking about what does this have to do with a poem. So when you think about someone reading a poem and a mouse in a maze, what does that have in common? Well, this mouse, he's going to be in the maze, and what does he want to do? He wants to get out. So he has to figure it out. So when we think about what we do with a poem, is we try to figure out the meaning. So now we're noticing a theme here. What do we do with a poem? We look at it closely, we listen to it closely, we try to figure it out. When you get to this next stanza, you'll have this visual of feeling the walls for a light switch and what that has to do with a poem. Here, water skiing on the surface of a poem. Think about that feeling of water skiing and how that feels. And also this word surface. Where does our poet want us to be with a poem? And then we think about what these last two stanzas means. What are we torturing out of the confession? What do some people do with poems that's bad? And then your big thing here at the end to find out what it really means. And all of this, we're trying to find a meaning to a poem. But what can some people do to find out the meaning of a poem, and what do others do?